You're walking down a quiet street, the sun sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows. You hear the faint sound of footsteps behind you. The hairs on your neck stand up. You turn around, but there's no one there. Just the empty road. You continue walking, but your heart races, your senses heightened. You can't shake the feeling that someone or something is watching you. For Emma, this feeling isn't just a passing thought. It's been her reality for years. Ever since that night. The night she witnessed a crime, but was too terrified to speak up. The night that changed everything. The killer is still out there, walking free, but something darker is about to unfold. Someone knows Emma saw it. Someone who isn't going to let her forget. Are you ready to find out what happens when the past catches up with you? Buckle up, because this is going to get intense. The day that changed everything. Emma was just a girl, no more than 10, when it happened. The kind of girl who loved reading books, playing with her friends, and drawing pictures of things she'd never seen before. She wasn't exactly sheltered, but her world was small and safe. Her parents were loving, her neighborhood was quiet, and her biggest worry was whether she'd finish her homework on time. But that night turned her world upside down. It was a cold evening in late fall, the leaves swirling in the wind. Emma had been playing outside longer than usual. The sky was darkening, and her mom had called her in for dinner, but Emma wasn't ready to go home yet. She liked the quiet of the evening, the way the air felt crisp against her skin, the feeling of being alone with her thoughts. She was walking home, cutting through the alley behind the old church, when she heard something. At first, she thought it was the wind branches scraping against the brick walls, but then the sound came again. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel. Emma stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding. She peered around the corner and saw him. A man. He was standing by the dumpster, facing away from her, but his posture was tense. His shoulders were hunched, and there was something about him that didn't feel right. She couldn't see his face, but his presence made her stomach churn. And then, she heard it. A thud. A low, painful sound. It made her freeze. She should have turned around. She should have run back the way she came. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Curiosity? Fear? Maybe both. Her heart raced as she watched the man lean over someone on the ground, pulling something from his coat. It was a flash of silver. A knife. Before she could even comprehend what was happening, the man stood up, wiped the blade on his sleeve, and walked away, leaving the victim behind. Emma didn't move. She couldn't. Her mind was a blur of thoughts. Was this real? Was she imagining it? Was this a dream? But when she finally managed to force herself to take a step forward, she saw the body. A man, older than her dad, lying motionless in the alley, his face pale, eyes wide open in shock. The blood was dark, pooling around him like a sickening puddle. Emma wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone. But her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen in terror. When the police came the next day, they found nothing. No fingerprints, no witnesses. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. And no one ever spoke of it again. Emma grew up in the shadow of that night. She never told anyone what she had seen. Not her parents, not her friends. No one. How could she? Who would believe a little girl who couldn't even bring herself to speak? The fear that gripped her that night never really went away. It lingered, following her through her childhood, through her teenage years. The killer? Still out there, free. Everyone had assumed it was just a random act of violence. An unsolved case. Maybe the man had been a transient, passing through town. Maybe no one had cared enough to look deeper. But Emma knew the truth. She had seen his face, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. It wasn't until Emma turned 23 that she began to feel it again, the watching. She was at a coffee shop, the same one she'd frequented for years, when she first noticed him. The man who had been there once, years ago, before she even realized what was happening. She caught a glimpse of his face through the window, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto hers. Emma quickly looked away, her heart racing. Her pulse was pounding in her ears. She didn't know why, but something about his gaze sent a chill through her. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, but she knew. He knew. He knew. Days passed. Emma thought she could forget it. That maybe it had been a coincidence, her mind playing tricks on her. But then it started. The messages. The first one was simple, just a cryptic note slipped under her door, written in block letters. I remember you. She froze. Her stomach twisted into knots. She knew what it meant. It had to be him. The killer. But why now? After all these years? The second message came a week later. This time, it was in her mailbox. You saw me. You know who I am. Emma's hands trembled as she read the note. She looked around, expecting someone to be watching her. But there was nothing. Just the quiet of her apartment, the distant hum of the city outside. Then the third message came with a photo. It was blurry, but Emma recognized the place, the alley. The spot where she had seen the murder. The photo was taken from behind a dumpster, as if someone had been standing in the same spot she had years ago. And in the background, there was something she hadn't noticed before. A shadow. A figure. She slammed the photo onto the kitchen counter, her mind racing. He was close. Too close. But the question lingered, how did he know? How did he know she was the witness? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Emma froze. She didn't want to answer it, but the knock persisted. Hesitant, she walked to the door, her breath shallow. She peered through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. The doorbell rang again. And then, a message. Just like the others. I know where you are. I'm coming for you. Emma didn't know what to do. The words on the note burned in her mind, I'm coming for you. She stared at the paper in her trembling hands, trying to breathe, trying to steady her racing heart. Her thoughts were a whirlwind. Was it really him? After all these years? How could he have known where she was, what she was doing? The knock at the door came again, this time louder, more insistent. Emma backed away, her feet dragging as if they were made of lead. She hadn't felt fear like this since that night in the alley. Her fingers grazed the phone in her pocket. But what could she say? Who would believe her? It had been so long since the murder, and no one had ever come forward with information. Still, her instincts screamed at her to call someone, anyone, but her phone felt too far away, out of reach. Then, the knocking stopped. Emma stood in the doorway, every muscle in her body frozen. She waited for what seemed like an eternity, but nothing came. No voice. No more knocks. The apartment was silent. And that's when she heard it. A soft shuffle from the hallway, faint footsteps echoing as though someone was slowly retreating. She didn't know if it was real or just her nerves playing tricks on her, but she wasn't going to take any chances. Grabbing her phone, she dialed the number she knew all too well, the police. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. I think I'm being watched. I don't know who it is, but someone's sending me these messages, threats. And I think they're coming after me, Emma's voice wavered. Please, I need help. The operator was calm, reassuring. Ma'am, I need you to stay inside. Do not open the door to anyone. Stay on the line with me until an officer arrives. Emma barely heard the rest of what the operator said. Her thoughts were already elsewhere, distracted, racing. Who was this person? Was it the killer from all those years ago, or was someone else playing a sick game with her? Either way, the terror she felt as a child was coming back full force. Minutes felt like hours as she waited. She tried to lock the door, check the windows, but it didn't seem to matter. The fear was relentless. The shadows seemed to lengthen as if the darkness itself was closing in around her. The police arrived quickly, 2 officers, a man and a woman. They took Emma's statements and reviewed the messages, but she could see it in their eyes, doubt. They didn't believe her completely. How could they? There was no physical evidence. No one had actually attacked her. Yet, Emma knew something was wrong. The fear in her gut told her she wasn't imagining it. "Ma'am, we'll have extra patrols in the area," the male officer, Officer Wright, said. "But if you get another message or see anyone suspicious, don't hesitate to call us again." The other officer, Officer Garcia, handed Emma a business card. "We'll keep an eye out. In the meantime, stay vigilant. And if anything feels off, you need to report it immediately. Is there anyone you can stay with?" Emma shook her head. She didn't want to involve anyone else. She didn't want to drag anyone into this nightmare. But the officers insisted, urging her to call if anything happened, no matter how small. Once the officers left, Emma locked every window, every door, and tried to breathe. She sat in the corner of her living room, hugging her knees to her chest, trying to convince herself it was all a mistake. The killer was long gone, right? He had to be. She was just imagining things, seeing shadows where there were none. The police had checked it out, they hadn't found anything. Nothing to suggest she was in danger. But then, in the silence of the apartment, something moved. A rustling sound came from the kitchen, faint but unmistakable. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She slowly got up, tiptoeing toward the kitchen, her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. What if he was here? What if he had been in her apartment this whole time? She pushed open the door. Nothing. But on the counter was something new, another note, identical to the others. Her fingers shook as she picked it up. "You can't hide forever. I'm closer than you think." The ink was smudged, as though it had been written hastily. But the words were clear. Emma's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, clutching the note to her chest. It was happening again. The fear, the memories, it was all flooding back. The killer knew. Somehow, he knew. The next morning, Emma woke up in a cold sweat, her heart still racing from the night's events. She had barely slept, her mind spinning with the implications of the note. She needed answers. She couldn't just wait for something to happen. She had to take control. The first thing she did was check her apartment again just to make sure. Her gaze flicked to the window, the door, the corners of the room. Nothing had changed. But the feeling of being watched was still there, gnawing at her, constant and unrelenting. She tried to go about her day as normal, hoping the paranoia would subside. But it didn't. Everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. When she walked through the city streets, she swore she saw a shadow following her. When she looked over her shoulder in the grocery store, there was a man with a coat too large, his face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Every time she glanced at him, he was looking back. By midday, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She needed to talk to someone who could understand what she was going through. She called her old friend from high school, Sarah, the one person she had always trusted. Sarah answered on the second ring. "Emma? What's wrong? You sound off." Sarah, I need to talk to you. Something is happening, and I don't know what to do," Emma said, her voice shaking. She told Sarah everything, the notes, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. "I don't know, Em. That sounds terrifying." But it could just be someone playing a sick game with you, right? Maybe it's not the same guy from all those years ago, Sarah suggested. I don't think it's a game, Sarah. This feels real. He knows. He knows what I saw, Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a long silence on the other end. Do you think he's still out there? The killer? Emma swallowed hard. I think he's been watching me. And I think he's going to come for me again. Later that afternoon, Emma decided to take a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear her head. She was tired of being cooped up inside, tired of feeling like a prisoner in her own apartment. As she walked through the park, her phone buzzed. It was another message. I know where you are. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around frantically, but the park was bustling with people, families enjoying the weekend, joggers passing by. But somewhere in that crowd, someone was watching her. And she had no idea who it was. The message, I know where you are, hit Emma like a wave crashing against her chest. Her fingers trembled as she dropped the phone in her pocket, her pulse racing with fear. How could he be this close? How was he tracking her every move? She scanned the crowd, her eyes darting from person to person. Was it one of them? Was it the man she'd seen in the park before? Her thoughts raced, but she forced herself to keep moving, to appear calm. The worst thing she could do now was draw attention. She had to figure out who was behind this, and why they were tormenting her. But every step she took seemed to echo louder in her mind, as though her heart was beating too fast for her own body to keep up. Emma kept walking, her feet moving mechanically. The park was beautiful this time of year. Fall had painted the trees in 100 shades of red, orange, and yellow, but all Emma could see were the shadows between the trees. The faces of the people around her blurred into one, and every glance made her feel more and more like she was being hunted. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She had to leave. She turned and made her way toward the exit of the park, the sickening feeling of being followed creeping into her chest. Every step she took felt heavier, as though something was pulling her backward, forcing her to stay in place. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream for help. But she couldn't. She had to be rational, had to think this through. Then, she heard it. A voice. Emma. It was barely a whisper, but it was enough to freeze her in her tracks. She spun around, her eyes darting across the park in a frantic search for the source. Emma. This time, the voice was closer. It was male, low, and somehow, familiar. Her heart stopped. She knew that voice. But where had she heard it before? Suddenly, the realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. That voice. It was the same one she'd heard all those years ago in the alley, just before the murder. The man. The killer. Emma's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She didn't know whether to scream or to run. Her mind was a jumble of thoughts, but only one question seemed to dominate: how? How was he here, so close to her after all this time? Her eyes scanned the area, and in the distance, near the edge of the park, she saw him. He was standing in the shadows, his face partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But she knew it was him. The same man. The same figure she'd seen all those years ago in the alley. Without thinking, Emma scrambled to her feet, her body moving on pure instinct. She didn't know where she was going or what she was doing, but she couldn't stay here. She couldn't face him. She ran. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as her feet pounded against the pavement. Her mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline. She could hear him behind her footsteps, slow and measured, keeping pace with her. He wasn't even running. He didn't need to. He knew she couldn't escape. She turned a corner and ducked into an alley, trying to lose him, but the alley was narrow, the walls closing in on her. There was nowhere to hide, No place to go. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, and Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Think, think. She screamed internally. There had to be something, some way out. But all she could see were the walls, the dark corners, and the empty street ahead. Her feet stumbled over the uneven pavement, and before she could stop herself, she collided with a trash can. She fell to the ground, her arms scraping against the rough concrete. Pain shot through her body, but she barely registered it. She had to keep moving. She had to get away. When she looked up, she saw him. He was standing at the end of the alley, just watching her, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The silence between them was deafening. "You remember me," he said, his voice low and cold. Emma's mouth went dry. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but her voice was stuck in her throat. She was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to think. All she could do was stare at him, her body trembling uncontrollably. He took a slow step toward her, and Emma scrambled backward, her legs shaking. "I never forgot you, Emma," he continued, his voice growing softer, more menacing. "You saw what I did, didn't you? All those years ago. You were just a little girl. A witness. But now, you're more than that." Emma's mind raced. What did he mean? What was he talking about? The murder? The crime she had witnessed? She couldn't understand. "You were too scared to speak, but I knew you'd remember," he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "And now I can make you remember everything. Make you understand why you couldn't tell anyone." Emma didn't know what he was talking about. She didn't understand, but the terror in his voice, the way he said "make you understand," made her blood run cold. Before she could react, the man lunged at her, grabbing her arm with a vice-like grip. Emma screamed, her body instinctively fighting against him. But he was stronger. He yanked her toward him, pulling her into the darkness of the alley. "You can't run, Emma," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "You never could." But just as quickly as he had grabbed her, there was a flash of movement. A loud thud. And then, silence. Emma's head spun as the grip on her arm loosened. She looked up to see a figure standing over her, another man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that seemed familiar. "Get away from her," the figure shouted, and the killer stumbled back. It was the police. Officer Garcia and Officer Wright. They had found her. Emma couldn't believe it. She was shaking, her body still reeling from the shock, but she was alive. The officers were pulling the man away from her, handcuffing him as he snarled and struggled. "You're safe now, Emma," Officer Wright said, his voice calm but urgent. "We got him." Emma could hardly comprehend what was happening. Her body was numb, her mind still clouded by the events of the night. How had the police known? How had they found her here, in this alley, just in time? As the officers led the man away, Emma's thoughts began to clear. She remembered the messages. The photos. The voice. The killer had been watching her all along. He had known she was the witness. But the truth was far darker than she could have ever imagined. The man they had caught wasn't just the killer. He was part of something much bigger. Something she would have to face head-on in the coming days. This wasn't over. Not yet. As the police escorted the killer to their car, Emma stood there, still shaking, but with one thought on her mind: what if the real danger was still out there?